Alrighty. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Auto Hawker podcast. Today I'm joined by a very special guest, author John Slaughter. Would you like to introduce yourself, John?
Yeah, man. First of all, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. For those who don't know me, I'm John Slaughter. I am a published author now. I've written two books, one fiction, one is a collection of essays, and I write regularly on Substack, mostly on cultural issues at Texas John Slaughter at Substack.com, and then I'm your typical sort of I guess shit poster, for lack of a better term, on Twitter. So. I kind of dip my toes into a little bit of everything.
Well, in this day and age, we need more Renaissance men. We don't and apologize everybody. It's the morning time when this is being recorded, so my aura is not exactly peaked yet. So anyway, where I was going with that is yes, we live in a time where everybody they want to specialize in something, but we kind of need people that can sort of multitask and do multiple different things. And I think John is somebody that can cover a wide variety of topics, and as something that younger men should probably look up to as an example of how to be when they get older. Anyway, though, we're not here to talk about those kind of things, though, are we, John?
No, no, I think we have some pretty interesting an interesting topic to dive into that a lot of people haven't learned about.
Yes, and on that topic, on that note, I don't know exactly where this conversation is going to go, but this is based off your book. And would you like to tell us a little bit, about your book, your book you wrote, your fiction book?
Yeah, it's called Crimson Veil. It's kind of hard to describe because it is sort of a in some ways it's a typical noir private detective story, but it's more of a uh, literary philosophical novel to some extent, insofar as it's more character driven than it is plot driven. But it takes place in the years following the World War II in the South, and kind of follows this private detective that's dealing with what is known as the Dixie Mafia, which again a lot of people are not really aware of, and I think it's something that a lot of people probably should read more into, because everybody's so aware of the mafia in the Northeast or in places like Chicago. When they think mafia, they think of the Italians and the Irish, and in more modern terms, that they think of the Russians or maybe the Yakuza. But organized crime had a very it was very prolific and very unique in the way that it manifested in the South. So the novel deals with a lot of that.
Yes, and that's the Dixie Mafia is something I've heard about all my life, being from the South. And I'm not really from the area where that occurred exactly, but as I've gotten older, I've realized that their power base, it wasn't just in the wiregrass of Alabama. It was in Georgia, northern Georgia specifically, and that places down like in Russell County, places in near Atlanta, that was kind of sort of their main hub of networking and work. And I think they might have also spread down into Louisiana a bit. So it was a very far flung organization. And now, on that note, kind of, or departing from that, what inspired you to write this book? But mainly in my sphere of kind of topics, what made you pick that whole like post World War II era?
So the big inspiration, at least for the setting, well, for the genre, is I've always just loved the noir genre, and it's not something you see much of anymore. But as for the setting, it was loosely based on a town called or a city called known as Phoenix City, Alabama. And there's actually a film about the city. I think the movie came out in the mid 1950s. And Phoenix City was known for a long time as the original Sin City. And one of the things that set it apart, to kind of contrast it with the way we think of the mafia in the North, When we think of places like New York or Chicago, and we think of the Italian mafia, we understand that they have certain areas that they controlled. They have certain businesses they controlled. They kind of had their hands in everything, but there's competing interests, between the government and other other organized crime organizations. But in Phoenix City in particular, and this is true for a large scope of where the Dixie Mafia operated, is that the Dixie Mafia controlled all of Phoenix City. Um, and when I say they controlled everything, I mean the churches in the town were used to launder money for the mafia through their collection plates, right, their offerings, and the basement of the courthouse was used to store the money and funnel it to casinos. And so with Phoenix City in particular, it's on the border of Georgia, and on the Georgia side of the river is Fort Benning. And because of World War II and Korea, particularly, you had an influx of soldiers because that's where infantry training is conducted, right? And so on the Phoenix City side of the river, on the Alabama side, the Dixie Mafia set up casinos that pretty much ran up and down the Chattahoochee River. And so the soldiers would come across the river and they would obviously gamble. They set up a lot of brothels, and these brothels were not just located in this strip known as 14th Street, but they were located even in the residential areas. Like this level of crime and control they have over the city is very difficult to understand, because you have to understand the entire city itself was bent to the will of the Dixie Mafia. Even the sheriff at the time was known to he would go out and drive down county roads, and they would pick up young women that were walking by themselves. They would arrest them, they'd charge them with a bunch of stuff, and they wouldn't release them on the charges until they had worked as a prostitute for so long. So these people had an immense amount of control over the city. And it got so bad, actually, that the General Patton, when he was there, threatened to drive tanks across the bridge and flatten the town. That's how bad it got. And reading these stories, and there's some stuff that I won't mention because it's kind of key to my novel, sort of the plot twist at the end. But these people controlled literally everything from the sheriff's department to everybody who, if you wanted to get elected as an official, you had to go to them, and they had to basically pick who it was. Um, they even went so far as when court cases did come up, they would get retainers on every attorney in the city, so you couldn't even pick an attorney to defend you locally. Um, and this spiraled like out of control to the point that the Albert Patterson, who was involved with a lot of the gambling, he was the attorney general for the state of Alabama at the time, and he got fed up with the prostitution. That was sort of where he drew the line because it had gotten so bad. And he decided to go after them. And he went to give a stump speech in Phoenix City about cleaning it up, because obviously a lot of the residents weren't happy about this, but they didn't really have the ability to do anything. And they assassinated him basically. That night he was walking to his car, and they just shot and killed him. Right, just with no, like, they weren't even worried about really hiding it. And that city operated that way even after the assassination, until his son would later become attorney general, um, and take down the Dixie Mafia within Phoenix City. But they splintered, and they moved up north to Tennessee. And actually, the film Walking Tall, the events of that, a lot of the individuals that were involved in that were people who had left Phoenix City after the city was finally cleaned up. But so that's sort of the setting of the novel. I started reading more about these stories and what they were doing. They're firebombing houses, and everything you think of at the mafia that was occurring down here. But one of the big differences is that it was it was a loose collection. It wasn't as organized in the same way as the Italians or the Irish or the Russians. There was no central committee, and as you alluded to earlier, a lot of it operated out of Atlanta, and then Biloxi was a huge hub, and New Orleans was a huge hub as well. But that's because the Dixie Mafia had partnered with the Italian. There was actually an Italian mafia presence in New Orleans that they were linked up with. But it's it was basically a very wide range and loose collection of of a crime syndicate that spread across the South. That I think, again, it has a very unique Southern flavor to the way the crime took place, and so I wanted to, in that novel, I wanted to really kind of give people a taste of that, as best I could.
And the funny thing about that is, like, still to this day, somebody like my grandfather, if I was to ask him about Phoenix City or just that area of the state, it's basically, be careful going down there, don't go down there. They kill people down there. They all this stuff. And I always thought he was talking about, just, modern day scholarship, gang violence.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's what he's talking about because I mean, it's definitely not Montgomery, it's not, Chirac. So he has to be talking about something else. And I kind of put two and two together and realized when he was a kid, this kind of stuff was going on. And so this is probably what he was referring to. But I guess to move on from my personal anecdote about the stuff, and the events that happened down there, are there any historical figures that are kind of draw parallels or inspired, or like you're trying to think of a word to use? Are there any like historical characters within this sphere of that event, that event and that organization that are a basis for your fictional characters?
Well, yeah, there actually is, a handful of characters in the novel that are based off of actual individuals. And I don't want to give names just because one of the reasons I was originally going to have the novel take place in Phoenix City, but as I did more research and talked to people I know, down there, I found out very quickly that this only occurred. This was in the 50s, right, and it ran into the late 50s. These people still have a lot of control over the city, and they still have a lot of money. The same families that were running this stuff, they still run a lot of what goes on in the city now. That, of course, mostly it's legitimate businesses now, but it's one of those things where when you're in Pink City, nobody talks about it anymore. And part of the reason nobody talks about it is because those people, the children of those people essentially are still alive, and those families are still operating. Um, and so, like, I looked at the main players within the city, um, and like I said, originally I was going to do sort of a historical fiction and utilize those actual individuals, and then I realized, like, well, I'm not trying to get myself in trouble, even if it was just legal trouble, because a lot of these families have tried to not necessarily distance themselves, but they create the atmosphere where, uh, you don't feel comfortable talking about it out loud. But I mean, I would encourage anybody, to who really wants to know, if you read the novel and then go and do some research into the Phoenix City story, which is what the film is called, you'll notice you'll notice parallels, and you'll be able to pick up really easily who's who uh, within the narrative.
Yeah, that's really cool. And when I've thought about working on stuff, kind of sort of, I have an idea for something. I haven't put pen to paper yet, but I know in my own experience, I live in an area where we had an issue with a law enforcement, corrupt law enforcement, and people, ironically, were saying that this guy was involved in the Dixie Mafia. People were saying that he did this, he did that. I'm not gonna name things because I don't know how true or untrue these things are. It was some really bad stuff. And do you think that the peculiar nature of the South and the quote unquote like good old boys kind of thing? Do you think that that lends more fuel to the fire for when the organized crime is created in the South?
Yeah, I think, so I think that what you see in the South is that there was already obviously, I think you have to take it back to the Reconstruction era and realize that Southerners in general had a very strong distrust of the federal government already, especially following the war. And then you roll immediately from that, not immediately, but not long after, you roll into the Prohibition era, and of course, as we both know, the bootlegging that occurred in the South, especially in Alabama in particular, is an interesting case because Alabama enacted prohibition about, I think, 2 or 3 years prior to federal prohibition. So the bootlegging sort of industry in Alabama was already well established, and most of it was taking place in the northern part of the state, in the hills, as opposed to the southern part of the state. But that so you have this natural distrust of the government due to the war, because we have to remember that that war is still within living memory by the time bootlegging sort of comes around and prohibition comes around. And that bootlegging tradition combined with this distrust, I think, lends itself to a willingness to defy the government, and that kind of carries its way, especially in these smaller counties where, like you said, there's this sort of good old boys club, and it lend itself towards a particular flavor of organized crime where you don't have these large urban centers where you have ethnic groups competing, because we do have to remember that a lot of the whether it's the Italians or the Irish, what these organized crime syndicates in the north are largely ethnic based, and part of it is a way to police their own neighborhoods and keep them safe due to ethnic conflicts. In the South, you don't necessarily have that, other than the racial tension that flares up from time to time. So in the South, it's literally just a series of it's more of a business venture around people that are conducting illegal businesses, um, to sort of defy the government. And it makes it really easy to embed themselves within, whether it's sheriff's departments or small local governments, where there's not a lot of competition there. You don't have multiple different syndicates operating. You have one criminal organization that's willing to get involved with the government, or get involved with the local government, and it makes it a lot easier. And so you get this very unique sort of, it's almost, no pun intended, but it's a loose confederation, right? In the same way that the Confederacy was, because again, like you said, they operate out of Atlanta, but they also operate largely out of Biloxi as well, and it makes it very difficult to deal with because there's no central hub to take down. So, like I said, you smash Phoenix City and you clean it up, and they just move to the next place. And it's really not until the RICO charges, like once the federal government can hit people with RICO, that's what really is the death nail to it, because you can chase them across state lines now, and you can pin them down. But yeah, the South, I think the attitude towards the government, due to the war and then due to things like prohibition, really kind of gave the South a particular viewpoint that allowed even more average people to be involved in illicit activities, and probably facilitated their ability to kind of control these small these small cities and towns much more easily than they would have if they were operating out of large urban areas like New York or Chicago.
And on that note too, it seems like a lot of what I'm going to call it political crime, or maybe organized crime is a better term for what I was going to get on about. In the South, it seems to be a lot more. From what I can tell, people are accused of it when they're in politics a lot more, and that it's like I'm going to give you an example, kind of, but I'm not going to name names because this is really close to home, and it's a very this is like a, I believe, if I'm correct, no, 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 never mind, never mind. I'm just gonna go on with what I was saying. Um, I know of a guy who he was in a position of power in the state, and he had to step down because he had an affair. And he's from around kind of where I'm from, and I was talking to somebody about it, and they said, "Oh, you didn't know so and so was corrupt? Well, do you know who his dad was? His dad was a major, like, I don't remember what position, but he was over something with like the state troopers or law enforcement, and they were talking about how he was, I think it was like using that to, like, smuggle drugs or something or whatnot, or sell them or selling evidence or something like crazy, and that he, was, pulling people over like kind of fraudulent reasons, things of that nature. And it just seems like whatever it was, he kind of did it for a time, got away with it, and was able to kind of sort of like, make a profit off of it. And, talking about, the hills, the northern part of the state, um, you know, being from that area, going and riding around, you, I mean, you could see why that kind of stuff would go on. And you could see why, you know, I would say that, the South went from, bootlegging to, marijuana and meth, because when you have these, just these forest canopies and these mountain ridges and these little valleys and places like that, you can, anybody really that just owns some land out there can grow stuff and make, probably decent money doing it. And, even to that extent, there's rumors that a local high school in that area, that they recruit their, good football talent based off drug money. So I think it's kind of interesting to see that, the sort of organized mafia, I guess you want to call it organized mafia, um, existed, and they more or less had to like dissipate, but that really the crime never went away.
Yeah, I think this kind of leads into an interesting point, and I've so bear with me on this because I haven't quite fleshed out this idea fully, but I do think that there's something there's a different the Southerners view politics and law in a much different way than our say our northern counterparts, especially, or even the Midwest does. You notice that up north, you know, when you're in school, you learn about Tammany Hall, right? And this reaction to the idea that the government in New York City is corrupt, right? And there's this sort of reaction from them is like, this is terrible, this is horrible. How could this happen? The government's supposed to be, you know, for the people and good. Um, and I think that largely stems to a degree from the sort of puritanical nature of the North, right? Because of who settled it, right? If anyone's read Albion's Seed, you'll kind of know what I'm talking about. But the South being predominantly Scotch Irish with like an upper class of Cavaliers, I think there's always been an acceptance of corruption. Like we inherently just accept the fact that our politicians are somewhat corrupt, and we don't care as long as we benefit from it in the long run, right? So you see somebody like Huey Long is a great example of this. Huey Long is corrupt. There's no doubt about that. But the people of Louisiana, by and large, unless they were extremely wealthy, didn't care because they were going to benefit from it. You know, you look at the amount of roads, and I don't remember the exact number now, but I think when Huey Long took over, there was like 300 mile of paved roads in the state, and by the time he's done, there's like 5,000, like some absurd increase in that. Or when he couldn't give textbooks to the schools because of legal reasons, right? Because I don't remember exactly why. So what he did was he just gave them for free to all the students individually instead of the schools themselves. And you see all this and you go, okay, well, Huey Long is corrupt. You know, he's constantly violating the state constitution, doing whatever he wants. But nobody really cared unless they were wealthy enough that they were being affected by it. The average person didn't care because they benefited. And you see the same thing to an extent with George Wallace, right? George Wallace, in many ways, is you could say is corrupt, but he does more for the state of Alabama than almost any other governor ever has. And same thing, he built tons of roads, he built schools, he started the community college system within the state, and up until, other than the civil rights issue, nobody cared about anything else he did because they benefited from it. And so I think you get a very different view of politics down here, as Southerners accept that level of corruption. But as long as that corruption is a net benefit, they don't get upset by it, I guess I should say. And they don't react in sort of a moralized fashion that you would see Northerners react in, because we don't expect the government to be anything other than what it is, or politicians to that extent.
And that's a fair notion too. I haven't read Albion Seed all the way through, but kind of knowing my history of Scotch Irish people, a lot of them are really they're denizens of the border region between England and Scotland, and over their blood ran thicker than party lines,
Mm.
and so I think there's an example of a minister in maybe it was in I think it was like Tyndale, somewhere in northern England, and he said something about to these border reaver people. That's what they called them, border reavers. And he said, basically like something to the effect of, "Where are all your churches?" And they said something basically like, "Oh, we don't we're not Christs. We're Elliot men. We're like we're Kerr men. We're whatever last name that exists, Grants, things of that nature. Like we're the men of that. We're not, that's our first loyalty is to these people that are, of the higher caste of that society, not the church, not the monarchy, not the monarchs, nobles. It's basically okay, like who is your, land, who owns your land, or who has the resources to protect your land. So it's a very even in war, on the English and Scottish side. Like I'll give you an example. There was the battle of there's like the battle of, it has a weird name like Pick and Carry or something. It was like a really like goofy sounding, you know, English British name, and it was like in the 1540s. And in the battle, the English were fighting the Scots, and they sent their border reavers to fight each other. And when they were fighting, all they were doing was playing with their swords. They actually, somebody from the one of the royal, I think it was the Scottish side, the king sent somebody to go basically see that side of the battle and see what was going on. And when they got there, all the border reavers were chatting it up, just sitting on their horses talking and making merry. And when they saw that this, delegation arrived to like see what they were doing, they just started, basically play fighting with each other, trying to make it look as real as possible.
Yeah, I mean that's probably, like you said, this is indicative of the clan culture, right? The Scottish clan. When we think of that, and a lot of people don't realize that, my part of my family falls under. I've done a lot of research on this. Falls under Clan Buchanan, even though that's not our last name. And you had septs, and then you had clans, and so each family would, sort of fall under a clan, and that clan had like an umbrella over a handful of other families, and that's the way it would work. And your loyalty was like, I think one of the old sayings is, me against my brother and I against my cousin and I think against the family, my family and I against the clan, my clan and I against everyone else, or something to that effect. And I'm misquoting to an extent, but that was the attitude, right? Was that there was these sort of concentric circles of loyalty, um, that started at the family level, but that you always set aside whatever differences you had with your brother to fight against your cousins, and you'd set aside your differences with your cousins to fight against everybody else, right? And that goes out, and that culture, like you said, with the Scotch Irish, comes over as they settle here. And of course, this is where you get Hatfields and McCoys. You get these famous feuds because they're rooted in this loyalty to the clan or to the family. And this is also why people get irritated with me when I make up this point, but the South has always been a little more uh socially they lean more socialist politically. Historically, they have, because part of it is that clan culture of like everybody takes care of everybody. So you get, this is why you have the Southern Democrats, which are very much, they're much more socialist than we would think of like Republicans today, right? And that's like the history of the South. And again, this willingness to see each other as a group and to lend each other a helping hand, or see the obligation to help the others, I think lends itself to, again, back to the organized crime, where it's like, well, we're loyal to each other before anything else. And so we're willing to do that. And also we're willing to allow our politicians to do certain things as long as they're helping us out. And this is why I always joke with people that if you want to see modern feudalism, you can come to Alabama, or the Deep South in particular, because you'll still see elements of that, where you'll have wealthy, powerful families down here that still control large parts of the state, and they have, the I guess the lower class, for lack of a better term, sort of loyal to them, right? And I'm sure you've noticed this. Like, one of the particular things that's interesting about the South is that you'll have these massive, uh, almost mansions, for lack of a better term, and then they'll be like right next door to them will be trailers, right?
Oh,
And this
oh,
is
not even that. You'll be riding through the middle of nowhere. I've noticed this more in the middle of nowhere places than like anywhere in like town. But you'll be a good 30, 45 minutes away from any like major city, and they'll just be just a giant like mansion out there. And it's like, well, who in the world is that? Like, who lives out here? Like, there's no other houses even out here, and some guy just got a nice house out here.
Yeah, and often, like, yeah, and you see that a lot, especially like you said, if down where the part of Alabama where I'm at is not as it's more loosely populated, I guess you'd say, because once you get in between, like if you're driving from Montgomery to Auburn, there's literally almost nothing in between except small towns, and you'll notice you'll come across, either like you mentioned, these gigantic mansions with nothing around them, or you'll see these gigantic mansions and they'll be, they might have a good, 5, 6 acres around them, but right next to it, where their property line ends, there'll be trailers or small houses or an entire trailer park. And like I said, that's why I joke that it's like modern feudalism, because it's similar insofar as, like, the feudal lord is living like right next to his peasants, and he's interacting with them on a daily basis, right? And so these guys who are from these families are stopping and going to the same gas stations, the same places as everybody else around them. And you get this sort of, you'll see this sort of weird loyalty that bleeds over from that. Like I said, this reminiscent of feudalism, and this sort of carries its way up, because even though a lot of Southern culture has been watered down over the last 100 years, and especially in the last 50 or 30 or 50, with the influx of industry down here, there's still a lot of that very loyal clan structure, or I guess the residue of it, where people are loyal to each other, with the good old boy system being, I think the prime example of that.
Yeah, and too, you also see, at least in my neck of the woods, from what I've seen, you have a lot of what I call hereditary politics, where a father or grandfather was something, and you'll have the people occupy that position in the government, or run for office like three generations down, and they sort of kind of talk like it's this sort of expected thing to do, that it's something that has to be done. And I even know somebody that has basically like pretty much said all their life, viewed all their life pretty much they just want to do what their dad does when their dad is not able to do it, because it's just like I guess it's like hardwired in a lot of people. And I guess it's a good old vestige of like Indo-European lordship. If your father's the lord, well, who inherits after him? Well, his son, of course. So I think it's kind of a holdover from that maybe has not survived up north for, well, for I would say the destruction of homogeneity in general up there.
Well, yeah, yeah. I think it's important to remember that one of the things that makes the South particular is that up until recently, again, there was very little immigration into the South. You had in the obviously early on, like you can look at the Civil War, and you'll find Beauregard, and other Catholic officers, right? Raphael Sims. There's obviously Jewish people. I mean, Shelby Foote is, his mother was Jewish, but those people came so early on. Um, those families did that they were integrated into Southern culture. Like even though they may have had different religious practices, culturally speaking, they were all Southern. And the South sort of uh, ossified to an extent insofar as there was no large influx of outsiders to disrupt the culture. So Southern culture for the longest time remained somewhat static, whereas with the North you had constant waves of immigration, right, through Ellis Island. And so the people that were in New York City setting things up get displaced by, the Italians come in, and the Italians eventually take over the construction industry. But then they end up, making enough money to move out, and the new immigrant group comes in and replaces them. And so there's never really a monoculture that's able to develop because of this constant influx and this changing. And like you said, there's no homogenous culture in the North really, as compared to the South, which was, even to this day, when you look at the vast majority of families down here, they've been here for pretty much forever. And I went through this when I was younger, and growing up, I never had I had never had any idea of what my family's ethnic background was, as far as like, were we Scottish, were we English, were we German? I had no idea because nobody ever talked about it because we never saw ourselves as that. Whereas like when I would meet people from up north, especially when I was in the Marine Corps, they would always describe themselves as some hyphenated American, or they would explain, well, my family's Irish or my family's Italian, etc. Well, I never. That was weird to me because I'd never even thought in those terms, right? Because Southerners, we were just Americans, That's the way we thought of ourselves, We didn't think of ourselves as anything else, and that culture really um, stayed relevant for quite a long time. And I see this now, where I live at, where the chief of police is the cousin with the sheriff, and the principal of the high school is also one of their cousins, and you get this, uh, it's sort of a nepotism that's kind of allowed because of the culture. Um, it just that people just accept it for what it is, and no one really questions it because you don't have these competing interest groups constantly coming in. And this is also why I always tell people that I think the only real American culture is Southern culture, because it's the only one that stayed static long enough. Ethnically stayed static long enough to develop something that was uniquely its own thing.
That's probably a fair line of reason on that. And in terms of the you saying about like we were just always American, is I guess a way to tell who the most heritage American people are the ones that can't even tell you what they are because they've been here for so long that nobody knows. And on that line too, I know back about almost it was 2 years ago now. I went with my grandfather and we went to he went to show me a cemetery where I had some family members buried. And I went out there and I was always told this side of the family was Welsh, but there was a ton of like Scottish people out there. People with like, Scotch Irish people and like actual Scots, maybe even Highland Scots buried out there. And there was also people with English last names out there too that I was related to. And it was just really weird for me to see that and see that, like, why am I related to a Stewart? But I'm also related to like I can't think of another that's the one that really stuck out to me was Stewart. Didn't even know I was related to any people with that last name. And that's the funny thing is like I think because of that, these people in the British Isles when they were coming here, I think Paul Fahrenheit or somebody said something about this one time that you really don't care if you're an Anglo or a Scot or a Gael or a Welsh if the Native Americans are trying to kill you and you're for it. Like nobody cares, if you speak English or Gaelic when the Cherokee are attacking your palisade and you have to have every man with a gun on the wall shooting. So I think that has a lot to do with why these, and I think generally, it's like, and there's modern research, from my understanding, that kind of reflect this, but the peoples of, when I say Northern Europe in this instance, I mean the British Isles, Scandinavia, and Ireland, I think have higher amounts of steppe ancestry than people in like Germany or France or Spain. So I mean, I would imagine that to a guy whose ancestors were like Vikings from Norway that came to England, he's going to look probably a lot like a guy that's from Ireland who's a Gael to some extent. And I don't think it always is, but they're going to look at each other and they could just it's kind of ambiguous ethnicity because they all look the same. They're all pale skinned, kind of blonde or brown haired, white men. And I think that's, probably led to a lot of these intermixings and things as these people are so similar, even on a cultural sense, because these people retained, their Indo-European, cultural aspects to some degree, and that it kind of just there's a king and feudal system or whatever you want to call it, vassalage system, in Ireland, just like there is in Scotland and England and Scandinavia. And these people more or less, it didn't matter really. Everybody got the big picture, when so it wasn't like it wasn't like Arabs moving into, Italian New York that the Italians came in and took out the Romanians or something like you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I mean, you have their cousin peoples, right? So there's not a huge amount of difference. Now, I will say that speaking to the ethnicity part, I didn't have any clue really what my background was, and then I did a genealogy project for my grandfather a few years ago, and I found out that on his side of the family, because they were fairly prominent in England for a very long time, that there was a lot of information regarding their heritage. So I was actually able to go back to the year like the late 900s, and they were Vikings that settled in the middle of the British Isles. And then on my father's side, I later found out that I'm mostly of Norman extraction. Um, and it's funny you say, you can't really tell the difference, but then like the more I researched it and I would talk and look at people I know and I'd talk to them and find out, well, their family's pretty much all English. You can kind of see the difference. Like, I can tell if somebody's to an extent, I can usually tell if somebody's like mostly English because there is a particular look, to them, but it's not like you said, it's not a huge difference. And I think there's a couple of things here. Number one, and I've written about this before, the concept of being white exists in the South, as you pointed out, to an extent, is it's contact with the other, right? So it's not just contact, like obviously with the natives, but you also have slavery in the South. And so you have a lot of African slaves, and when you're surrounded by that, you notice the similarities between the other, European peoples that you're around as opposed to noticing their differences. And so I think that constant interfacing with the other created more of a unity. And so you get this concept of like, well, we're white, right? Whereas again, the Northerners don't necessarily think in those terms because they didn't have the other next to them all the time. So they were able to constantly kind of bicker about their smaller differences. But so I think that's where you get sort of, like you said, that plays a large role into the cultural thing, right? Because it allows for the blending easier. And as they blend, um, the differences, over time kind of fade away, and people lose, the ability to identify whether they were, unless their last name is something obvious like O'Connor or something, they don't know if they're Irish fully, or they're, or they're English, or they're Norman, or Scottish. But then you get, of course, every family down here claims they have some Native American lineage, which in my case turned out to, at least as far as I can tell, turned out to not be true at all. But I think another interesting point to this too, that a lot of people don't ever think about, is that they a lot of the genetic information we have now has shown that in Europe, because of the feudal system and the monarchy, and the way society was structured, essentially having a caste system, not nearly as strict as they had in India, or they have in India. It created genetic differences, and they can actually see, there's a very clear distinction genetically between sort of the upper classes in Europe and the lower classes. And this is because upward mobility was pretty much limited. The only way to move up was if you're a really attractive woman, right? If you're an attractive woman, you can marry up. But if you're a guy, you're stuck where you're at. There's no moving up. You can't marry up, right? But then when you come to the United States and you're bringing people from across Northern Europe, like you said, and mostly from, the British Isles, you're getting people a lot of times that are across the social spectrum. And those people, because of the limited amount of, like, let's say, marryable women, you get a lot of mixing across these social lines. And I think this plays a weird role in the upward mobility, in why Americans are, I would say, why Americans kind of have an allergic reaction to class, because we sort of intermingled those. So you get, and you see this all the time, right? You have these families where it's like a mix of people that are clearly from different class backgrounds, and that sort of fuels this desire to have an open, upwardly mobile society, if that makes sense.
No, I think it does, and I think I've even picked up on some of those things in my family, because you have people that are just of, and when we talk about these different backgrounds, this could be, something that's 200 years in the making. You could have somebody that's of like poor Irish extract, and then have somebody of like Anglo Cavalier, extract, and they come to this country, and then like 200 years later, their descendants marry each other, and so and have kids, and so these things aren't exactly always short term, um, and
Well, I
that
mean, I
that's
actually have a prime example of that from my own family history, which is that I found out that both uh, my great grandfathers on both sides, I'd only traced back father to son on my mom's father's side and my dad's father, and I found out that my grandfathers on both of those ends were both at the Battle of Kings Mountain together, which was an officer in the Continental Army, and came from a very wealthy British family, and they were rich planter class, for lack of a better term. And then the other grandfather, my father's side, was they were originally from Scotland, and they had fled during the English Civil War to Germany, and then they came over here. So they weren't really German, but they'd been in Germany long enough that they spoke German, and their names had become uh, uh, Germanic, right? But they were at the same battle together. One fighting as a militiaman, the other one as an officer. And then you fast forward, 200 years later or whatever it is, and their descendants get married and have children, and I'm here, right?
that's really cool, and I haven't done research into my. I mean, I've asked around. I've kind of poked and prodded. Apparently, my great grandfather, he was a amateur historian, maybe amateur genealogist, and he might have discovered some stuff, but it was so long ago that he did this, like probably in the 80s. that I don't even think he wrote down anything. So I think it's all by word of mouth. And so I'm just under the impression that I'm some kind of like half half Puritan, half Irish. But like apparently the Irish is like Anglo Irish. So it's really weird, really odd, and I don't know, man. It kind of sometimes I think you do want to have like you do want to have like a very clear ethnic background that it adds some kind of stability, but at the same time, when you're the group that has been here the longest in this country, it kind of does sort of add like a sense of pride when everybody else here, is in a time since like less than you, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that because of because of the way American history has been taught, and the massive influx, the ethnic changes across the country over the last, especially since the post Hart Sellers Act, um, what it what an American is doesn't really exist. And we can say, yeah, well, heritage Americans are the real Americans, but it's very difficult to parse that out fully. And so I think one response is to either dig your heels in and say, well, no, I'm a heritage American, we're the real Americans. The other one is to look back and try to say, okay, well, where are we actually from? Like, what cultural ties do I have? Right? Because I do think it is difficult when you no longer have the the acid of liberalism, and the nature of that ideology, right, has destroyed what it is to be an American, and has left us with no real traditional or cultural uh, things to hold on to. And so the response to that for a lot of people is to try to go back and find, okay, well, where am I from, and what people do I belong to? And in the case of people like ourselves whose families have been here since, like, my family was here before it was America, right? Like, it was when it was the colonies. Um, there is no real tradition that we can pull on because it's all been eroded. So for a lot of people, hey, let me find out where I'm from. That'll fix that, right? Um, it's either that or try to distinguish yourself as the real Americans. And as you and I both know, that's kind of difficult to do without being labeled as, without being some type of ism attached to you.
Yeah, and definitely on the ism, and as we can see that it's not exactly the most helpful to be labeled with an ism or an ist. So unless it's your job, for an ist. So that's and the R word, doesn't make money, so you can't do that for a job. And I kind of wanted to ask you because I know you said we were going to do like a hard hour, and I think we're a little past that. But I know that you obviously plan on writing more stuff. What do you have any future settings you would like to have something take place in or write something in?
Yeah, I do. I'm currently in this weird space where I'm trying to. So many people have pushed for a sequel to the book that, in some ways, I'm trying to force one, and I'm not sure if I'm going to go that route or not. But I definitely want to, regardless of whether I end up writing a sequel or I write another standalone novel. One of the time frames and the areas I want to kind of explore a little bit is the early, uh, the probably the panhandle of Florida, down near like Apalachicola. I kind of want to look into that because there's a lot of interesting stuff kind of occurring down there, especially when you look at like rum running. And then outside of that, the other one that I want to really play with, and I started working on this and I never finished it, is I want to focus on the post Civil War South, but particularly um, river pirates, which a lot of people don't know existed, but they did, and it was very common back when the waterways were the main, basically the highways of this area, because we have so many rivers down here. and across the South in general. But river pirates were a thing, and so that's another setting I want to kind of get into because I think it's kind of an interesting. It's an interesting topic because there's these like hideouts and caves where they would hide, they would meet at, and when you read about them, I think one of them was called like the Bloody Bucket, and it's literally like a cave up near. Um, I want to say it's up somewhere up near where like Waterloo, Alabama, on the border of Tennessee, but they're like this cave where like river pirates would just hang out and like drink and party and then go raid any ship, raid any boats that were floating down the
Well,
river.
you know,
So that's the other area.
that's funny that you mentioned that because, I mean, I know that part of the state you're referring to, and I think, I don't remember who it was, but there's a little short story called "The Ransom of Red Chief," and it takes place. It's basically about that, about like these. I don't know if they're exactly like river pirates, but it's these guys they kidnap like this rich kid, and I think they do get him on a boat or something, and it's basically like the whole plot of the book is basically it turns out this kid is super annoying. He just fights with them. He just screams. He gets on their nerves so much they just let him go. It's basically what the book is. It's like a comedy, but it takes place out in like Northwest Alabama, and it had something to do with them being on a river.
Hmm.
And then I'll know too that there was a I don't remember his name now, but he was actually like I mean he wasn't like an old west outlaw um in the style of Jesse James in the same period, and he went all over the South, and I think even like into like West Texas and places, robbing banks, getting in gunfights, and they ended up actually chasing him down to Montgomery, and he had a shootout on a train in Montgomery, and I think he basically led him around a circle around Alabama, and eventually they like shot him dead somewhere near his house, and he
I
lived.
think I know exactly what you're talking about because I've read about him when I was looking at like famous Alabama outlaws.
Yeah, what was
But
his
I can't
name?
remember his name.
And then apparently the Jesse James gang came through Alabama too,
Yeah, I knew that. Yeah, up
which
through the
I
northern part of the state.
which I didn't know that. You know, my where I live, is fortunately not well. Earlier, I depicted it that it was kind of crime ridden, kind of crime infested, but not like in a sense of like violent outlaws shooting people, things of that nature. At least, at least like Jesse James type criminals. We have criminals, of course, but yeah, I think the river pirate thing is something that really does need to be explored. And do you know if it was bigger? Um, I imagine it was bigger before
It was.
Reconstruction.
It was bigger before, especially in the era of you know what flatboats are,
Yes, like the pioneer ones, like the Missouri River and
right?
all that.
Yeah. So early on, right? Because people forget, you know, that this area of the country, the South, and parts, you know, Ohio, Kentucky, that was the original frontier. And so when they would get on the rivers, you know, when you wanted to go downriver, it wasn't you couldn't go upriver, right, upstream. So they would build these flatboats that were designed to just to be taken apart when they got to their destination, and they would load everything on them. And usually you'd have like one or two people often on the top, and they'd have these big long poles, and I forget what they call them now, but they would use them to kind of push off the banks and to keep the boat in the middle of the river, and they would just float down, and then you wound up where you were. And what the pirates would do, if we want to call them pirates, they would have their boats, and they would hide out in like little gullies and stuff, and they'd wait for these people to float down the river full of, you know, whether it was cotton or, you know, food or whatever they had on their flatboats, and they would rob them. And that's what they would do essentially. But like you said, it was bigger pre Civil War, because you know you don't have steamships and all that stuff.
And too, another antidote that wasn't in Alabama but up in Tennessee on the Tennessee River was have you heard of Jack Henson?
I don't think so.
Well, Jack Henson was a he was basically like Mel Gibson from The Patriot, but for the Confederacy, and he was famous for sniping Union soldiers off boats. And this guy was doing it in a cave in his free time, and he had a custom made rifle with a scope on it. And from my understanding, for like 3 years, he sat there in this cave and just shot people off boats because they killed his sons who were squirrel
Right.
hunting. So, and they never arrested him. They never tried him for anything. But I mean, he never enlisted in the Confederate Army or anything. He had a bone to pick, so
Hmm.
he was doing that.
So see, this is one of the things I think that, and I don't have the time for it, but I do think it would be beneficial for one of the guys in our sphere to really kind of dig into more of that information, because a lot of the lore and the history around some of the whether you want to call them outlaws from the South, or maybe some of the sort of tall tales, like those are kind of been lost, right, to a large extent. Like nobody does anything with them anymore. You never hear about them. I mean you don't even hear about John Henry or Pecos Bill anymore, right? But much less some of these particularly southern characters, which I think have faded with time, especially because of, their nature of their connection to the Confederacy. So it'd probably be beneficial for someone to kind of start digging more into that, because a lot of this stuff is going to disappear with if somebody doesn't.
Yeah, and that's true. I mean, I tried to do that with Sam Dale.
Yeah,
He
Sam Dale's an interesting one.
he was I would say really he was more of a frontiersman maybe than even like Davy Crockett was. I set respect to Crockett, but Sam Dale was of a different. He was an Indian fighter. You could say Davy Crockett was a frontiersman, a great outdoorsman. You could maybe say the same with Daniel Boone, but I mean, Sam Dale was, he was a fighter. I mean, that guy was a warrior looking for conquest.
I mean, yeah, and if anybody listening to this, just go Google Sam Dale and read about how he died and like that last fight with the Indians. That alone is an interesting read.
Well, he didn't die fighting Indians. He actually died. He should have died. He actually died in
Wait, did he
Meridian,
survive
Mississippi.
like with the
The canoe
canoe?
fight. Yeah, he survived
Yeah.
that.
Oh, he survived that. Okay, I thought he died in that
No,
canoe
no,
fight.
no, the canoe fight, he won, and that's the thing about the canoe fight that's crazy, is him and 3 other men took on, like, 13 natives in hand-to-hand combat in canoes and beat them.
Yeah,
I
because I remember, if I remember correctly, he was like shot or stabbed or
Yeah,
something.
he
I mean,
was
he
he
was
was
messed up
injured.
afterwards. Yeah.
I think his friend got clubbed in the head by a
Mm.
rifle, and I think he had been stabbed and shot up. I know he almost died, in one of the first battles of the Creek War, or no, it was before the Creek War. They had a skirmish with some Creeks, and they were going through like what do they call them? It's not important, like a marsh, a canebrake, and
Okay.
he had a Creek shoot the guy that was in front of him. So he dropped down and used the guy's body for cover. And when the Indian came out of the woodwork, he tried to shoot the guy, and his gun jammed. And the guy ran over there and was going to scalp him, and that guy got shot by his friends that were coming up behind him. So he should have died multiple times.
Interesting. I mean, yeah, someone needs to like. And I know there's a statue of him. I forget which park, but yeah, these are the characters I think that need to be mythologized in some capacity. Which, to I know we got to jump in a second, but for the sake of the conversation, the part of that story I was working on was going to, what I wanted to do was take a lot of the lore and the mythology from Alabama, and kind of, the river pirates were partly a vehicle for the main character to sort of traverse the state, and it was going to be kind of like the Odyssey. So as an example, like one of the chapters I had written was they come upon a cabin that is very much reminiscent of the Lotus Eaters, but instead of lotus flowers, it was sweet tea and pecan pie.
Well, a lot of people, especially down that that Wiregrass way, that Montgomery way, would enjoy that kind of stuff. Think
Yeah, I
up,
might still jump into it at some point. I
I
don't
think
know.
up here it's more like barbecue and Coke.
Not that nasty white barbecue sauce y'all like.
Yeah, yes, on the chicken. It's pretty good. It's pretty good.
No,
But
I'm kidding. I've had it before. It's not bad.
yeah, it's meant for chicken. I forgot who actually invented it. I think it was one of the guy. I think it was a guy from Decatur invented it, and they won some stuff with it. But all I know is it's apparently kind of meant for like those like barbecue chickens or whatever. I don't think it was meant for pork. I've never had it on pork. Well, no, I've never had it on pork. I was trying to think of a particular incident where I had some, but it was on a chicken sandwich. But I guess before we end this, um, do you think as a whole, um, this sphere needs to push historical fiction and get more people writing it?
That's a difficult question. I go back and forth on this because I think we need more people creating art in general. Because I do think that a lot of people don't understand the power that that art has over the way people conceive of things. So I do think it. I think to there's a degree which yeah it would be beneficial. I think, but I also think that we have to keep in mind that especially in the form like with literature, people don't read anymore, so it's it doesn't have the return on investment that we would like it to. I still think it's a worthy pursuit, but unfortunately, you're not going to the age of like the influential novel. I think is gone at least for the time being. So I think actually I think a worthy pursuit would be for somebody to try to write I don't want to say young adult fiction, but not for like little kids, but like something reminiscent of like that's for like the Hardy Boys age range. To take some of that historical fiction and gear it towards maybe a younger audience. There's also room to do it for an older audience too, but I think even I think there's a space there that's lacking. There's a vacuum when it comes to stuff geared towards younger people, and I think the historical fiction element, especially if you're going to dive into frontiersmen or Civil War heroes or whatever, I think that would be really beneficial to gear towards a younger audience, if that makes sense.
I think it does. Well, tell us where we can find you at.
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at J Slaughter Esquire, and then if you're interested in my novel, the pinned tweet is the link to my Amazon where you can purchase that. And then if you want to check out my articles or my other writings, it's Texas John Slaughter at Substack.com, and I post fairly regularly there. So if you're interested in that, you can check it out. It's every article I write is free for like the first 3 weeks and doesn't go behind a paywall till after that. So you can always go check that out.
Alrighty, well, y'all know where you can find me. And do you have any projects we need to be looking out for possibly anytime soon?
Like I said, I'm trying to work on a second novel. So, and knowing me, it took me almost 3 years to write the last one. So it'll probably be a while, but there is I do have a collection of my essays in physical copy that I recently released about a month and a half ago. And it's a collection of essays that just stems over a ton of different topics because I kind of just write about whatever's on my mind. So that's kind of there to placate everybody in the meantime until my next novel drops, whenever that might be. But that book is called Dispatches from the Old South Repository, and you can find it on Amazon as well. It's also linked on my if you go to the pinned tweet and you see my novel, it's linked with that one as well.
Alrighty, well, good old white boys getting white boy stuff done. I like it.
We
All
try, we
right,
try.
we do. Alrighty, John. Well, I'm glad you came on here, and I appreciate your time and effort and what you've been doing. And you're a valuable asset to this community. So, without further ado, thank you all for watching, and we hope you all have a good weekend. And God bless.